This is not an isolated case. It is not simply a local ruling. It strikes at the very heart of religious freedom in Europe. Because when a court comes to judge not a material crime, but the way a religious community lives, obeys, and is spiritually formed, then the issue changes completely. And the question becomes inevitable. Where does justice end, and where does state interference in the life of the Church begin? On March 24th, a ruling was issued in Privas, France, that is sparking controversy far beyond local borders. At the center of the proceedings, Father Bernard Dominy and the Catholic community Famille Missionnaire de Notre Dame, a group with approximately 160 members. After 2 years of investigation, the court issued 10 decisions, 7 acquittals, and 3 convictions. Father Bernard was convicted on 1 count and acquitted on 4 others. The community was convicted on 2 counts. The sentences: a 6-month suspended sentence for the priest and a fine of 25,000 euros for the community. These numbers, taken as they are, might seem modest, but the point isn't the severity of the sentence. The point is, what was judged? The charges do not involve abuse. They do not involve physical violence. They do not involve financial fraud. The heart of the case lies elsewhere. The charges speak of abuse of vulnerability and psychological subjugation. These concepts, in themselves, open up a very delicate area. But even more significant is what the investigations focused on: the internal life of the community. According to the trial, the court examined factors such as the group's hierarchical structure, spiritual formation, and leadership. In other words, what has always constituted the very essence of every organized religious community. Not deviant behaviors, but structural dynamics. 2 of the 5 former members who filed complaints have been recognized as victims. Their charges include, among other things, alleged isolation from their families and limited communication. A significant portion of the prosecution's case is based on these elements. And here, the first crux arises. Because anyone familiar with religious life knows that separation from the world, community discipline, spiritual guidance, and even certain forms of family detachment are not abnormal. On the contrary, they are historical characteristics of many monastic and missionary experiences. The defense clearly argued the contested practices were typical of religious communities. Not exceptions, not deviations, but normal expressions of a vocational choice. And not only that, according to the defense, these accusations are contradicted by the testimonies of other members and their families. But that's not all. During the trial, disputes over procedural fairness also emerged. The defense stated that it had not had access to 9,000 pages of documents and that only 9 of the 19 proposed witnesses were interviewed. These facts, if confirmed, would raise significant questions about the right to a defense. However, to truly understand the significance of this affair, we need to broaden our perspective. Because this trial didn't arise in a vacuum. It fits into a very specific legal and cultural context, that of contemporary France. In 2024, the French regulatory framework was strengthened specifically in the area of psychological subjugation, as part of policies aimed at countering so-called sectarian tendencies, a legislative evolution that has introduced more effective tools to intervene in situations deemed to constitute mental manipulation. But this is precisely where the strongest criticisms emerge. Some observers speak of legal concepts that are too vague, definitions that are difficult to define, and therefore potentially dangerous. Because when a category is elastic, the risk is that it can be applied extensively, affecting very different situations. The key question then becomes this: Where does the line lie between spiritual guidance and psychological pressure, between religious obedience and undue subjugation? For centuries, religious life has been based on principles such as obedience, spiritual direction, and personal renunciation. These elements, when interpreted with modern and secularized categories, may appear problematic, but in their original context, they represent the very heart of the vocation. If these elements are reinterpreted in light of new legal criteria, the risk is clear. What was previously considered a spiritual path could be seen as a form of conditioning. And this leads to an even more radical question. Can a state determine which forms of religious life are acceptable and which are not? Can it delve into the internal dynamics of a faith community without effectively becoming the arbiter of religion itself? France has a long tradition of secularism. The separation of church and state, established at the beginning of the 20th century, was created precisely to guarantee mutual freedom. The state does not interfere in religion, and religion does not interfere in the state. But in recent years, something seems to have changed. Regulations against sectarian tendencies, laws on separatism, and new legal categories related to psychological manipulation point in a different direction. No longer just separation, but also control. And in this context, cases like Previs take on a significance that goes beyond the individual defendants. They become precedents, signals, potential models for future applications. This isn't to deny that abuses can exist within certain organizations. Recent history clearly demonstrates this. But the problem arises when, in an attempt to prevent abuse, one ends up calling the entire structure of religious life into question. When hierarchy becomes suspect, when spiritual guidance is reinterpreted as manipulation, when the choice to detach from the world is interpreted as imposed isolation. In this scenario, the dividing line becomes very thin. Father Bernard and the missionary family of Notre Dame have already filed an appeal. The case will be reviewed in the coming years, but regardless of the judicial outcome, the issue remains open. Because what's at stake isn't just the responsibility of a priest or a community, it's something deeper. It is the very definition of what a religious community is in a secularized society. It is the right to live a vocation according to one's own rules, without these being automatically translated into criminal categories. And perhaps, above all, there is the risk that a new principle is emerging, that faith, when lived radically, must be justified before the state. A principle that, if taken to its extreme consequences, completely changes the relationship between man, the church, and civil authority. And at that point, the initial question returns with even more force. Are we really judging a crime, or are we starting to judge religion itself? What do you think? If you liked the video, comment, Amen. God bless you.